a limit. Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, and the speed and force of the Republican response reveals that congressional tolerance for presidential emergency declarations has reached its absolute breaking point. President Trump just invoked emergency powers for the fifth time in 4 months, this one declaring a national economic emergency to impose sweeping tariffs on virtually all imports without congressional authorization. And the reaction from Republican lawmakers has been immediate, unified, and fierce in ways that surpass every previous confrontation over executive authority. Within hours of the emergency declaration, more than 60 House Republicans and 30 Senate Republicans issued statements opposing the action. Republican committee chairs announced investigations into the legal basis for the tariffs, and leadership in both chambers committed to bringing termination resolutions to votes this week, regardless of White House threats. This is not just another round of congressional concern followed by acquiescence when pressure intensifies. This represents Republican lawmakers concluding that the president's emergency governance strategy has become so systematic and so divorced from genuine crisis response that allowing it to continue would permanently transform the American constitutional system into something the framers never intended, and that future presidents from both parties would exploit without limit. So imagine this moment Tuesday morning when congressional offices opened and staff members started checking news alerts, phones exploding with constituent calls, trade associations frantically reaching out to explain how the new tariffs would devastate their industries. Republican members who spent years defending free trade principles suddenly confronting a president from their own party imposing the most protectionist trade policy in nearly a century through unilateral executive action. Because what Trump just declared wasn't a limited emergency response to a specific trade dispute or a targeted action against a particular country's unfair practices. It was a comprehensive restructuring of American trade policy, accomplished entirely through emergency powers, imposing 25% tariffs on imports from virtually every trading partner based on the claim that America's trade deficit constitutes a national emergency requiring immediate executive action without congressional involvement. Because right now, Trump has declared an economic emergency to impose sweeping tariffs, and GOP lawmakers are pushing back hard in ways that dwarf previous Republican resistance to presidential overreach. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal dated November 14th, the emergency declaration invokes the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs ranging from 15 to 25% on imports from more than 50 countries, affecting approximately $3.2 trillion worth of annual trade. And the declaration characterizes the U.S. trade deficit as a national economic emergency that threatens American prosperity and security, and claims that immediate tariff action is necessary to protect American workers and industries from unfair foreign competition that has devastated communities across the nation. Let me fill you in on why this particular emergency declaration has triggered such fierce Republican opposition when previous declarations on other issues generated more measured responses. According to reporting from Politico dated November 14th,
If you're working on a project at home and tired of constantly changing discs for different materials, this is just for you. Check this out.
The immediate reason is that trade policy represents one of the few remaining areas where congressional Republicans maintain relatively unified positions built on decades of conservative economic thinking about free markets, comparative advantage, and the dangers of protectionism. When Trump declares emergencies to redirect infrastructure funds or impose technology restrictions, Republicans divide based on how they weigh policy outcomes against constitutional process. But when he declares emergencies to impose comprehensive tariffs that congressional Republicans overwhelmingly oppose as substantively terrible policy, the combination of policy disagreement and constitutional objection creates a level of Republican unity that previous emergency declarations never achieved. Senator Pat Toomey, who represents Pennsylvania and serves on the Banking Committee, issued a statement within an hour of the emergency declaration that captured the intensity of Republican opposition. According to reporting from The Hill dated November 14th, Toomey stated, "What the president announced this morning is not an emergency response to a genuine crisis. It is a systematic assault on congressional authority over trade policy wrapped in an emergency language. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to regulate foreign commerce and to set tariffs. For 230 years, Congress has exercised this authority because the framers understood that trade policy affects the entire economy and should reflect broad national consensus rather than presidential preference. This emergency declaration doesn't respond to any crisis that emerged suddenly, requiring immediate action before Congress could deliberate. It imposes a comprehensive protectionist trade policy that this president has wanted since taking office, but that Congress has consistently refused to authorize because such policy would devastate the American economy. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because Toomey's statement was immediately followed by similar statements from Republican after Republican, representing a breadth of opposition that congressional observers say is unprecedented for any presidential action in modern history. According to reporting from the New York Times dated November 15th, by Tuesday evening, 64 House Republicans and 32 Senate Republicans had issued public statements opposing the tariff emergency, with many using language far stronger than typical congressional criticism of presidential actions. Representative Kevin Brady of Texas, who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee and has been one of Trump's most reliable defenders on tax and economic policy, stated that this emergency declaration represents a presidential usurpation of congressional authority on a scale we have not witnessed since FDR's court packing scheme, and it cannot be allowed to stand. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who has been in the Senate for more than 4 decades and who has supported Trump on virtually every major legislative fight, delivered floor remarks Tuesday afternoon that were described by observers as the harshest criticism of a president from his own party they had witnessed in years. According to reporting from CNN dated November 15th, Grassley stated, "I have defended this president through multiple controversies because I believed he was advancing conservative principles and that congressional Republicans had an obligation to support a president from our own party when his actions fell within constitutional bounds. But what happened this morning crosses every constitutional line and violates every economic principle I have fought for throughout my career. The president has no authority to impose these tariffs without congressional authorization. The trade deficit is not a national emergency. It is a macroeconomic condition that reflects American consumption patterns and capital flows. Using emergency powers to impose comprehensive tariffs that Congress has refused to authorize represents exactly the kind of executive overreach that led the framers to give Congress exclusive authority over trade policy. The economic arguments against the tariffs are uniting Republicans who might otherwise be divided over constitutional questions. According to analysis from conservative economists published in the Wall Street Journal dated November 15th, the tariffs will function as a massive tax increase on American consumers and businesses, raising prices on virtually everything from automobiles to electronics to clothing to industrial inputs. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that the tariffs will cost the average American household approximately $2,400 annually in higher prices, with disproportionate impact on lower income families who spend larger portions of their budgets on tradable goods. For Republicans who spent decades building political identities around opposing tax increases and promoting free markets, supporting tariffs that amount to regressive consumption taxes imposed through unilateral executive action is politically and ideologically impossible. The business community response has been equally intense and is reinforcing Republican opposition. According to reporting from the Washington Post, dated November 16th, virtually every major business organization, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Business Roundtable, and industry-specific groups representing sectors from agriculture to technology to retail, have issued statements condemning the tariffs and calling on Congress to terminate the emergency declaration. These organizations have substantial political influence through campaign contributions and lobbying operations, and they're making clear to Republican lawmakers that supporting the tariffs would cost them business community support in future elections. The agricultural sector is particularly alarmed because farmers understand that other countries will retaliate against American tariffs by imposing their own tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports. According to reporting from AgriPulse, dated November 16th, the American Farm Bureau Federation issued a statement warning that retaliatory tariffs will devastate American agriculture, which depends on export markets for approximately 40.
Welcome to the world's largest invention factory. In here, we design, test, and produce hundreds
Percent of production in many commodities. Republican senators from agricultural states are hearing from farmers that the tariffs threaten to destroy markets that took decades to develop. And these senators are making clear they will not support emergency declarations that harm their core constituents. Let's talk about the legal basis the administration is claiming for these tariffs, because the constitutional theories being advanced are even more aggressive than previous emergency power claims. According to reporting from Politico dated November 16, the Office of Legal Counsel issued a memorandum concluding that the president possesses inherent constitutional authority over foreign commerce that allows him to impose tariffs through emergency declarations when he determines that trade conditions threaten national economic security. The memo argues that while the Constitution grants Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, it also grants the president authority over foreign affairs, and that trade policy falls within the overlap of these authorities in ways that give presidents broad discretion to act unilaterally when they perceive threats to American economic interests. This legal theory is being rejected by constitutional scholars across the ideological spectrum as lacking any basis in text, structure, or historical practice. According to analysis from Professor Jonathan Turley, published November 16th, the administration's claim that presidents possess inherent authority to impose tariffs based on their foreign affairs power would effectively nullify the Constitution's explicit grant to Congress of power to regulate foreign commerce and to set tariffs. The framers gave Congress these powers specifically to prevent presidents from imposing trade restrictions unilaterally, because they understood from British experience that allowing executives to control trade policy leads to economic favoritism, rent seeking, and policies that serve narrow interests rather than broad national welfare. Professor Ilya Salman of George Mason University went further in analysis published November 17th, stating that if the administration's theory were accepted, it would mean that virtually any constitutional power granted to Congress could be claimed by presidents as falling within their foreign affairs authority, because nearly every domestic policy has some connection to foreign relations in our interconnected world. This would transform the Constitution's careful allocation of specific powers to Congress into a general grant of authority to presidents that could be invoked whenever they claim foreign policy justifications. Now, let's be real for a second about what's driving the extraordinary breadth and intensity of Republican opposition to this particular emergency declaration. According to interviews with dozens of Republican lawmakers conducted by congressional reporters and published November 17th, the resistance reflects several overlapping concerns that have finally converged to overcome the political pressure to support the president. First, the substantive policy is terrible in ways that Republicans cannot defend to their business community supporters or their economically informed constituents. Second, the constitutional violation is so clear and so extreme that Republicans who ignore it lose all credibility to criticize Democratic presidents for future executive overreach. Third, the pattern of emergency declarations has become so systematic that it's obvious this represents a governing strategy rather than crisis response. And fourth, Republicans are calculating that the president's political position has weakened sufficiently that defying him on this issue carries acceptable political costs. This last point is crucial because it suggests that Republican opposition is partially opportunistic, that lawmakers who might have acquiesced if Trump seemed politically invincible are now willing to resist because they sense vulnerability. According to polling from Morning Consult conducted November 15, 17, Trump's approval rating among Republican voters has declined to 79%, down from 87% just 2 months ago. More significantly, 52% of Republican voters say they oppose the tariff emergency declaration, with only 38% supporting it, These numbers indicate that even among the Republican base, there's recognition that comprehensive tariffs represent bad policy, which gives Republican lawmakers political cover to oppose the emergency declaration without fearing overwhelming primary challenges. The legislative response is moving with remarkable speed. According to reporting from The Hill dated November 17th, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell held a rare joint press conference Wednesday, announcing that the Senate would vote on a resolution terminating the tariff emergency on Friday, just 3 days after the declaration was announced. McConnell stated that emergency powers exist to respond to genuine crises that require immediate action before Congress can deliberate through normal processes. Trade deficits that have existed for decades do not constitute emergencies. Comprehensive trade policy that affects every sector of the economy and every American consumer must be made by Congress through regular legislative processes, not imposed by presidents through emergency declarations. The commitment from McConnell to bring the termination resolution to a quick vote is particularly significant because it represents the Senate's top Republican using his procedural authority to facilitate congressional action against a president.
Once a year I do a program
Yeah.
that's for free. I started during COVID, and as they're shutting down all the stadiums around the world, and I was like, I have plenty of other businesses, but this was my mission.
From his own party. According to reporting from Politico dated November 18th, McConnell told Republican colleagues in a closed-door meeting Wednesday that I have spent my career defending Senate prerogatives against executive encroachment, and I will not stand by while a president from my own party usurps congressional authority over trade policy through transparently illegitimate emergency declarations. House Republican leadership is moving in parallel. According to reporting from the Washington Post dated November 18th, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy announced Wednesday that House Republicans would introduce a companion termination resolution and that he expected it to pass with overwhelming Republican support. McCarthy stated that Republicans believe in free markets, limited government, and constitutional separation of powers. This tariff emergency violates all three principles, and House Republicans will not support it regardless of political pressure from the White House. The White House response has been characteristically aggressive, but also increasingly ineffective. According to reporting from Axios dated November 18th, President Trump spent much of Wednesday calling Republican lawmakers who announced opposition to the tariff emergency, attempting to convince them to reverse their positions. But unlike previous pressure campaigns that successfully broke Republican resistance, the current effort is reportedly failing because lawmakers have concluded that the combination of terrible policy and clear constitutional violation makes supporting the emergency politically impossible regardless of threats. Multiple Republicans have told reporters that the president's calls were counterproductive because his arguments revealed fundamental misunderstanding of both trade economics and constitutional law. According to reporting from CNN dated November 19th, Senator Ben Sasse told colleagues that Trump called him Wednesday evening to demand support for the tariff emergency, and when Sasse explained that comprehensive tariffs would raise prices and hurt consumers, the president reportedly responded that tariffs don't raise prices, they make American products more competitive. Sasse stated that when the president doesn't understand basic economics and insists that tariffs, which are literally taxes on consumers, don't raise prices, it makes clear that his trade policy is based on fundamental misunderstandings rather than on any coherent economic theory. Here's where the story reveals what's actually at stake, beyond the immediate question of tariffs. According to analysis from the Brookings Institution published November 19th, the confrontation over the tariff emergency represents a definitive test of whether the Emergency Powers Reform Act passed earlier this year has established enforceable limits on presidential authority or whether presidents can circumvent those limits through legal theories that preserve emergency declarations form while eliminating their constraints. The Reform Act requires congressional approval for emergency declarations to remain in effect beyond 30 days and prohibits using emergency authorities to circumvent explicit congressional decisions. But the administration is claiming that when presidents declare genuine emergencies based on their assessment of national security threats, Congress cannot second-guess those determinations without violating separation of powers. If Congress successfully terminates the tariff emergency through veto override, which current vote counts suggest is virtually certain, It will establish that the Reform Act's constraints are enforceable even when presidents claim national security justifications. According to constitutional scholars, this would represent the most significant congressional reassertion of authority over emergency powers since the original National Emergencies Act was passed in 1976 and would establish precedent constraining future presidents from both parties. The international implications are also significant. According to reporting from the Financial Times, dated November 20th, American allies have expressed relief that Congress is moving to terminate the tariff emergency because the tariffs would have triggered trade wars affecting the entire global economy. European Union officials told American counterparts that they had been preparing retaliatory tariffs affecting approximately $400 billion in U.S. exports if the American tariffs took effect, which would have created a spiral of protectionism, reminiscent of the 1930s trade wars that deepened the Great Depression. Congressional action to prevent this outcome has been welcomed by allies as demonstrating that American institutional checks on presidential power remain functional. The vote scheduled for Friday will almost certainly result in the Senate passing the termination resolution with more than the two-thirds majority needed for veto override, according to projections from congressional observers published November 20th. The expected vote will be approximately 78-22, with 32 Republicans joining all Democrats to terminate the emergency. The House vote is expected to produce similar margins when it occurs next week.
Snap your W-2 and file your taxes 100% free. Plus, get your biggest refund.
Roughly 37% of filers qualify. Simple Form 1040 returns only.
File now.
Pay when you get 3 pants. Yes, these viral jeans is on massive sale today.
These overwhelming majorities reflect the unique combination of factors that make the tariff emergency impossible for Republicans to support: substantively terrible economic policy, clear constitutional violation, systematic pattern of emergency abuse, and sufficient political weakness that opposing the president carries acceptable costs. For the audience watching this unfold, what this means is that the American constitutional system's checks and balances are finally functioning as designed on emergency powers after years of gradual erosion. Trump declared an emergency to impose comprehensive tariffs without congressional authorization, and GOP lawmakers pushed back hard with unified opposition that will result in the emergency being terminated through veto override. This outcome demonstrates that congressional constraints on presidential authority can be enforced when lawmakers prioritize constitutional duty over partisan loyalty, but it also reveals how specific circumstances must align for such enforcement to succeed. The policy must be terrible enough that substantive disagreement reinforces constitutional objection. The president must be politically vulnerable enough that opposing him seems feasible, and the constitutional violation must be clear enough that defending it becomes impossible. Whether this represents a turning point where emergency powers return to being genuine crisis responses rather than routine governing tools, or whether it represents a temporary victory that will be followed by future presidents developing new theories to circumvent congressional constraints, will be determined through future confrontations over executive authority. But for now, the tariff emergency has triggered the strongest institutional pushback against presidential overreach in modern history, demonstrating that separation of powers can still function when enough legislators decide that defending constitutional structure matters more than maintaining party unity with a president who views any institutional resistance as personal betrayal. Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, and the speed and force of the Republican response